You're listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute, a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and education institute making law work for people, places, and the planet. If you enjoy the podcast and want to support our work, consider donating at eli.org/donate.
Hi, listeners. Welcome to another episode of People, Places, Planet. I'm your host, Dara Albrecht, and I think you're really going to like our topic today. I have the pleasure of welcoming Rebecca Riley and Saff Killingsworth to the podcast today to talk about the current state of bees and pollinators in the U.S. Rebecca Riley is the Managing Director for Food and Agriculture at the Natural Resources Defense Council, and she's an attorney. She's been working on endangered species issues since 2005 and has worked on a host of different animal issues, from wolves to polar bears. But she started focusing on pollinators and food and agriculture issues around 2014 and has been focused on that area ever since. Saff Killingsworth is an endangered species conservation biologist at the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, and she leads the State of the Bees initiative at Xerces, which is their effort to understand the conservation statuses of all U.S. bee species. So prepare to be amazed, and thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks for having us.
So, in today's episode, we'll learn about the roles that bees and pollinators play in their ecosystems, hear about interventions and current actions to protect bees' status, and learn about how they match up with current legal frameworks. But first, could the two of you give us a quick introduction on the roles that bees and other pollinators play in their respective ecosystems?
So bees are super important both to ecosystems and to our food systems. Bees pollinate 1 out of every 3 bites of food we eat, and 70 out of the 100 most produced crops in the world. So they're very critical to producing everything from tomatoes to almonds, pumpkins, lots of produce that we all know and love. But they're also really important for pollinating all sorts of other species and are really at the base of ecosystems because the vast majority of plants need some sort of pollination to reproduce. And so if you lose pollinators like bees, that has a ripple effect throughout the ecosystem. And so conserving bees and other pollinators is really critical for the health of the natural world.
Yeah, and I'll just add that pollinators, the name given to this group of animals, because they assist in the movement from pollen from one flower to another. And it's a fairly diverse group, which includes mostly insects, so flies, beetles, moths, butterflies, wasps, and bees, and also some vertebrates like bats and birds as well. So within this group of pollinators, bees are considered the most effective pollinators because they're the only group that actively collects pollen. So the female bee will gather pollen at the flower site and then transport that back to the nest to feed her larvae there. And it's this active pollen transportation that makes bees more likely to contribute to successful pollination than other animals. And in addition to the role that these animals play as pollinators, they also provide other ecosystem services as well. So, for example, butterfly larvae are a source for birds and other insects, and they also contribute to herbivory pressure, which is just a force that shapes systems generally.
Thanks for that explanation, Saff. It's fascinating that certain pollinators are active pollen collectors or passive pollen collectors, and that they might have different intersecting roles. What is the current state of bees and other pollinators in the US and across the world? Saff, could you start us off with the scientific status? And Rebecca, could you give us the legal recap after?
So we have evidence that pollinators, including bees, are declining in abundance and diversity across the globe. The rate of decline in abundance is estimated to be somewhere between 1% and 2% each year. And we know from bumblebee extinction risk assessments that have been done by the Xerces Society scientists and other bumblebee researchers that about a quarter of bumblebees in the US and Canada face some level of imperilment. And then there's also been a number of recent studies that demonstrate dramatic declines in Western US butterfly species, including species that are both widespread and species that were historically considered common. So that's just 2 recent examples of groups of pollinators that we know are facing some imperilment. We know less about the status of other pollinators like solitary bees, flies, and wasps. But we do know that many of the threats that act on our better studied pollinators, like bumblebees and butterflies, are likely acting on some of our other pollinator groups as well.
So legally, the vast majority of pollinators don't have any protection in the United States. And we know there are about 4,000 native bee species in the United States alone, and that's just bee species. So there's so many pollinators, and very few of them have legal protections. The protections that the species do have, for the most part, come under the Endangered Species Act. And there are only a few species listed as threatened or endangered that are pollinators. And that's particularly true for insect pollinators. There's the Carner's blue butterfly, there's the Heinz emerald dragonfly, and then there's my favorite, the rusty patch bumblebee. And that's my favorite because NRDC worked for many years to get protections for this species and is still working to this day to ensure that it has critical habitat as well.
Saff, you mentioned abundance and diversity as two of the ways that decline is measured. Is it important to have an abundance of one species, or is it more important to have a diversity of many species? Do we have to preserve as many as possible? And are their interactions with each other also important?
Yeah. So ideally, we could have both. We want both stable populations where a given species is present at the abundance it was historically, and that abundance doesn't fluctuate too much with human caused activities. But diversity is really crucial here because there are many different kinds of bee species and other pollinators that have different behaviors, pollinate different suites of plants, emerge at different time periods. Preserving the diversity of all of these bee species is crucial to the pollination of the huge diversity of wild plants we have in our ecosystems and in our agricultural landscapes.
And Rebecca, you mentioned a statistic earlier that was absolutely mind-boggling, that 1 out of every 3 bites we eat of food is pollinated by a bee. So is preserving a large diversity of pollinators beneficial to our food and agricultural system?
It's important to preserve as many pollinators as possible because different plant and fruits and vegetables require different kinds of pollinators to reproduce. So it's not just enough to have one type of bee out on the landscape. You need all of these different types of pollinators to make sure all of the diversity of plants can reproduce.
We've heard a little bit about the current state of bees and other pollinators and what's going on. But what threats are these populations actually facing, and what are their conservation needs?
So, bees and other pollinators are facing a number of threats. The first one I'll mention is the big one, which is climate change. We all know that climate change has an impact on species, and bees are no exception. NRDC has been working, obviously, to fight climate change for many, many years, but that our work around that is more focused on climate and less focused on bees. But it is critically important for biodiversity in general. I would also add habitat loss, and I'm sure Saff can talk about this more. Habitat loss is a huge threat to most species, and particularly for bee species. The particular habitat that different species need is often developed, whether it's for agriculture, to build homes. And so the prairie habitat, the various kinds of habitat that bees need is diminishing fast. And then there's the big one that we focus on at NRDC, which is a class of pesticides called the neonicotinoids. These are insecticides. They are incredibly pervasive, and they're also very persistent in the environment. And so we use them very heavily in agriculture, and they're neurotoxic, and they are designed to kill insects. And you can imagine why that might not be very good for bees. So we're blanketing the landscape with these pesticides, and that is increasingly being recognized as one of the most significant threats to pollinator species.
And could I ask one clarifying question before Saff jumps in? So, about the neonicotinoids, or neonics for short, you mentioned that they're used a lot in wide scale agricultural projects, but I'm wondering, I'm based in Washington, D.C., and we don't exactly have many large scale farms here in town. Are those kinds of neonics still a problem in urban areas? Are they accessible to anybody?
So we use neonics in several ways. We use them in agriculture, and one of the big uses is something that's called a seed treatment. That's actually the vast majority of neonic use throughout the country. And what's really crazy about the seed treatment is it's used without any regard to the actual level of pest threat. So, what science is increasingly showing is when we use neonics as a seed treatment, we're putting huge levels of pesticide into the environment. This is threatening bees, but it's also threatening lots of other species like birds, deer. It is, of course, really bad for human health. And it's not, for the most part, increasing yields for farmers. So it's one of these uses that it just doesn't make sense. But we also use neonics in lawn and garden, on golf courses. And for bees, that can be particularly significant because when you think about bees, they're not pollinating corn. They are pollinating those flowers that someone has in their landscaping. So those lawn and garden uses are also very important.
Saf, in terms of the threats that wild bee populations are facing, do their needs differ from those of other pollinators?
Yeah. Yeah. So among even just the bees, there are huge differences in the way that threats may act on certain species, and many species are widespread. We can divide bees into a couple different groups based on their biology, but one of the ways that we can do that is contrasting bumblebees to solitary bees. Bumblebees are social bees with a caste system. So they have queens and workers, and they have these long flight periods where they're active from spring until fall. They typically forage from a wide range of plants, and many species are widespread. Contrast that to solitary bees. These bees do not have a caste system. They live their lives mostly alone. And these bees have really short flight periods where they're active for only a couple of weeks. They can have much narrower ranges. And many species are dietary specialists, meaning that they only forage from a restricted subset of plant species. And so all of these factors combined for our solitary bees may contribute to a little bit more precarity for them. For example, habitat degradation may be more impactful for a really narrowly distributed solitary bee species with a narrow dietary breadth than it might for a widely distributed bee that forages from a wide range of plant species.
Interesting. So there's a lot out there about the threats bees are facing. What about gaps in the scientific knowledge?
We still have a lot of questions about bees, especially solitary bees, and every pollinator species has specific needs, but most species have not been directly studied. There are three main areas of knowledge gaps that I've identified in the work that I've done. The first major gap is at sort of a foundational level. A lot of what we know about solitary bees is due to the work of bee taxonomists and their work with museum collections. So, taxonomy is this science of naming and classifying things. Bee taxonomists work to define species, which is the common unit of conservation. And it's also the science that's responsible for the development of aids to identify bees. But taxonomists and museum collections have been underfunded for decades. And that impacts our ability to effectively understand what species are in the US and how to access data associated with them. And then furthermore, these identification aids that would allow non-specialists to identify them in the field. So that's a major area that challenges our understanding of bee conservation. Another major gap regards the specific ways that bees make their living. So we lack a lot of life history information for many species. This is things like what's the dietary breadth of a given species, or what are its specific habitat requirements? Where does a species nest? And that lack of comprehensive understanding of life history really hinders our ability to understand how threats might act on a given species. And then the last area of gap that I'll address is information about how bees are doing across their entire ranges or over time. So we generally lack comprehensive survey and monitoring data for most species. And that makes it really hard to determine things like the range limit of a given species, what threats may be acting on a species within its range, or a population trend. And even though there's this huge laundry list of data we want, we do know enough about certain threats to address them for bees generally now.
So, these gaps in the knowledge, why? Is it just a function of bees' small size? They're tiny and hard to capture and study?
Yeah, I think that's one element for sure. They're very challenging to identify for non specialists. A lot of bee species require expert identification. You actually have to have the bee in the hand under the microscope for most bee species identification. Bees can also be kind of idiosyncratic. Certain species don't emerge every year. So if you're trying to monitor a bee at a certain site every year, you may just not find it in certain years. And then also there's this element of the way that data is stewarded. Much of our bee data comes from museum specimen collections, and the underfunding of that institution means those data aren't always publicly available.
And that point you brought up about bees' social structures is really interesting. It makes me think of my favorite class that I took in college, this course called Biology of Terrestrial Arthropods. And we talked about bees and pollinators and other insects a lot. And one of my main takeaways is that you don't even realize that these very tiny creatures have these very complex lives, and they're not always predictable. They have caste systems and social cliques and all these different kinds of behaviors. And I love that you pointed out that even just their complex ways of being affect the way that we can study and understand them too. Moving forward, are there any ongoing interventions to promote wild bee conservation, particularly successes or any major challenges?
So, NRDC has been focusing very much on reducing neonic pesticide use because that's what we think one of the most important things we can do to move the needle on pollinators. And we've had some really big recent successes. One of the biggest was the passage of the Birds and Bees Protection Act in New York State. And the reason that was so significant was because it is the first state law to really tackle the neonic seed treatments that I talked about earlier. So neonic seed treatments are the most common use of neonics, and they are, for the most part, not helping farmers improve their yields. So they are just this use of pesticides that we don't need. And what the New York law does is it sets a system that really acknowledges that fact. It's modeled based on something that was tried and is still being used in Quebec, where it allows farmers to use neonic seed treatments on corn and soy, but only if they have a demonstrated pest issue and can demonstrate that need. So we don't want to completely leave farmers in the lurch if they have a pest problem. But what we want to get rid of are all these indiscriminate uses where we're just using neonic seed treatments without any thought and kind of as the standard. And so that's what's really exciting about the New York state law. It also will stop lawn and garden uses of neonics. Now, that's also important for the reasons I mentioned. Bees visit flowers, and so it can be a really important exposure route. And banning lawn and garden use is a way to reduce exposure. Now, New York is not the first state to do this. There have been other states, including Nevada and Maine and New Jersey. And that's something that we're starting to see across the country. We're starting to see this idea of getting rid of lawn and garden uses of neonics take hold in state legislatures across the country, which is super exciting. NRDC also just settled a lawsuit with the state of California about the regulation of neonic seed coatings. Throughout the country, both federally and in state laws, there's what's called the treated article exemption. And what that means is that EPA and many of these state regulatory bodies don't consider the treated seeds, which are this huge source of neonics, a pesticide. And so they don't regulate them as pesticides, which is wild. So we sued the state of California over that. And they will be working on a rulemaking to hopefully close that gap. And so that's another exciting way forward. Part of what we're just looking for all the time is the different ways we can tackle this issue. And so in the states at the federal level, if we can try different strategies and see what works and what can reduce neonic contamination but still allow agriculture to grow the food that we need. Those are the strategies we want to pursue.
There's also a number of other interventions that we can use to address habitat loss and climate change. And we can do that through habitat restoration and protection to increase climate resiliency. And this kind of work is being carried out by a number of different entities. One way that we do this at Xerces is by working with agricultural producers to help them adopt methods that are better for pollinators. And through this avenue, we've supported the creation or management of 1.8 million acres of pollinator habitat across the US. We also develop and distribute regionally appropriate habitat kits designed specifically for the benefit of pollinators. And these are installed in urban farms and gardens, working lands, public lands, and residential and community spaces. There's also a program that we run called Bee City USA and Bee Campus USA, where we support cities and campuses in adopting practices that benefit pollinators, including some elements of pollinator habitat. But one area that I'll focus on is about pesticide use. So this year, the vast majority of our campus and city affiliates reported changes to their pesticide use, including eliminating pesticide use altogether or switching to organic practices, using pesticides as a last resort, or halting cosmetic applications. We also work on interventions to better understand where wild bees occur and what they need so that people who manage land can protect and enhance their habitat. And we do that through some of our community science initiatives, including the Bumblebee Atlases and Bumblebee Watch. And in those initiatives, we collect data on bumblebees so we can better understand where they occur, what some of the trends in the populations of our most imperiled species are, and to better understand what sorts of threats they're facing. And then the last intervention that I'll highlight quickly is including bees specifically in conservation efforts. So I work directly with state wildlife agencies as they update their state wildlife action plans. These are plans developed by each state's wildlife agency to prioritize conservation for the wildlife that occur within their state. And so getting bees on the list of species of greatest conservation need allows states to allocate funds for conservation and prioritize conservation for bees.
One thing I'll add is one of the fun things about working on bees is there is this citizen science element and something everyone can do in their everyday lives because we all encounter bees. These aren't like wolves or polar bears or these other species that you may or may not see in your everyday life. Bees are something that's all around us. And many of us are gardeners, we have flowers. And so there are ways for citizens both to participate in citizen science, which can help track and count species, can help identify endangered species. I'm always looking to see if I can find a rusty patch bumblebee. I haven't done it yet, but I really hope someday I will. But also to eliminate pesticide use in their own yards, to talk to their local park district, to eliminate pesticide use in the parks, and to really make a difference where you live. And because people love bees and pollinators so much, we see a lot of energy around these kind of initiatives.
I like that as you're both talking about citizen science initiatives and rulemakings and encouraging people to use more environmental and pollinator friendly pesticides. What I'm hearing is that none of these actions are really forcing a blanket ban on folks, but maybe taking the approach of educating and motivating them to use practices that are ultimately more friendly to pollinators and to them. Even the New York law that you mentioned, Rebecca, it's not outright banning pesticides, but it's encouraging folks to use it as a last resort. So you must demonstrate that you have a true pest problem before you can use a more harmful pesticide. And I think it's important to borrow a phrase that Rebecca said about not leaving farmers in the lurch and ensuring that human needs are also taken care of to ensure a more sustainable coexistence. And there is one thing I wanted to follow up on as well. I've heard before about a widespread issue in conservation. I know that folks tend to prioritize and be a little more receptive to big, charismatic wildlife like tigers or pandas or blue whales. But when it comes to a lot of pollinators, bees sting or people are scared of bats. But then people also do love pollinators. People love butterflies. You can find a tote bag with a bee pretty much anywhere now. So I'm wondering the way that people view bees and pollinators. Does it help or hurt their conservation initiatives?
I think the way people view pollinators helps because, like you mentioned, people love bees. And you can see that, you can buy bee socks, there's bee jewelry, there are lots of movies about bees. People are very fascinated by the social structure. Bees are just something that really motivate people. And so I do think they're not charismatic megafauna, maybe they're charismatic microfauna. But, you're right about some other pollinating species might not be quite as popular with the public. But I think people realize, we need bat to control mosquito populations. They can understand how a species fits into the web and fits into an ecosystem. And I think that can be very motivating as well.
Yeah, I think insects can be really charismatic once you start looking, but they don't often get the funding and the attention that they need. And one issue here is that even if we know that a pollinator is in peril, there's uneven conservation protection across the US due to an issue with management authority. So, this is due to the fact that many states don't recognize insects as wildlife. So there's no public agency that's able to do work on the conservation of insects in some states unless that insect is considered a pest. And that's only 1 to 3% of insects that are considered pests. And we're trying to change that at the state level. So Xerces Society recently supported legislation in Colorado to give their state wildlife agency authority to work to conserve insects. And that law passed. So we're now looking to a couple other states, including New Mexico, Nevada, Oregon, and Arizona, where I live, just to name a few, to make that change and include insects as wildlife worthy of conservation efforts. Doing that would allow states to advance the conservation of imperiled insects before they get to the point of needing federal protection, like an endangered species listing.
Wow, I had no idea that insects in some places were not even considered wildlife. So, in those places where they're not considered wildlife, are they just not considered?
Yeah, there's no agency within those states that is able to work on their conservation. The only way that they're managed, that insects are included in management, is sometimes by state agricultural entities to manage pests. And this is just a number of states. Most states at this point do have management authority, but there are a number that still do not.
So, Saff, you coordinate the State of the Bees initiative, which aims to conduct an extinction risk assessment for every wild bee species in the US. That's a big project. Can you tell us more about the work you're doing here?
Yeah, so this is a collaborative effort between the Xerces Society and Dr. Hollis Woodard's lab at UC Riverside. It also includes the efforts of Dr. Oscar Martinez Lopez, and we collaborate with the state wildlife agencies of Texas, Vermont, Washington, and California, as well as the Vermont Center for Eco Studies. And so, what we're working together to do is to understand the conservation status of all US bee species so that we can effectively prioritize and implement conservation measures that support bees. So we know there's at least 3,600 species of bees in the US, but we only know about the conservation statuses of about 600 species that have been previously assessed by other organizations and entities. So that means there's 3,000 species of bees in the US that we really don't know if they're stable or if they're at risk of extinction. But there's been this increase in funding and interest in wild bee conservation in the last several years, which is awesome. But if we don't accurately know which bees are imperiled and which bees are stable, we can't effectively direct conservation. So within the State of the Bees initiative, my work focuses on conducting extinction risk assessments for the bees that have not yet been assessed. And these assessments rely on two standardized approaches that assess imperilment. One is nature serve methods, which are used in the US and Canada. And these methods easily feed into state level conservation actions. And then I also use a global standard method from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature Red List, the IUCN Red List. So, in addition to assigning a conservation ranking to each individual bee species, like least concern or vulnerable or endangered, these assessments also collate information about the life history, diet, habitat distribution, threats, and recommended conservation actions for a species. And these are important because they help inform conservation objectives. So, for example, At the state level, bees that have been ranked using extinction risk assessments can be more easily incorporated into state wildlife action plans, which makes them eligible for funding and conservation attention.
That's really interesting, and it's awesome that it can inform conservation attention at the state level. Before I ask Rebecca how you would apply those, what is the current legal landscape with respect to bees? What does the Endangered Species Act, or the ESA, actually do for bees? Okay,
So the Endangered Species Act is an incredibly important law for protecting species like bees. And like I mentioned, it only protects a few pollinating species and a few bee species right now. And those species tend to have very small ranges. So there's lots of work we need to do. But what the Endangered Species Act does is it both drives resources and scientific attention towards these species, and it creates processes for the federal government to ensure that anytime it does something, whether it's building a new highway or reapproving a pesticide, that it's required under the law to take a look at that action and ensure that it will not drive that threatened or endangered species to extinction. And that's what drives a lot of the impact of the law. But in addition, the Endangered Species Act provides something called critical habitat, which is a type of habitat protection for these species. And, mapping alone can be a really important part of protecting a species, finding out where it lives, identifying those most important features to its habitat so that hey, if we, destroy this nesting area, that's going to harm the species. That science can be really important, not to mention the additional protections of the law under critical habitat. So the Endangered Species Act can be very important, but there are other laws that have the potential to protect bees. One of the laws that regulates pesticides is called the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. We call it FIFRA for short. It is the law under which pesticides in the United States are registered for use. Now, it is not a very strong law, and I often contrast it with how we look at approving drugs under prescription drugs. And maybe that's because I'm a pharmacist from a past life, but I think it's an important way to think about why we're falling short on pesticide regulation. When you look at a prescription drug, a company that wants to get their prescription drug on the market has to do a lot of research. They have to do a bunch of trials, and they have to prove that the medication is both safe and effective. The way we regulate pesticides is exactly in the reverse. So instead of requiring companies to prove that their pesticides are safe and effective, FIFRA just says that EPA should look at whether a pesticide is having unreasonable adverse effects on human health and the environment, but it doesn't impose the same kinds of requirements for testing. And it's sort of the reverse. It's requiring someone to prove that the pesticide is causing harm rather than requiring the company to prove that it is both safe and effective. And I think that's at the root of a lot of the struggles we have around pesticides because we don't have as much science and the standard is sort of flip-flopped. There's also a law called the Food Quality Protection Act. It actually is a modification of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which is the law that regulates prescription drugs. And it does provide a path towards regulating pesticides if the dose that people are being exposed to is too high. So NRDC does have the Food Quality Protection Act petition before EPA right now. We're anticipating a decision on that petition soon. And basically what EPA looks at is what are called food tolerances, which is basically the level of this pesticide on foods and whether that is safe for human health. So that is another law that has the potential to regulate pesticides. And then there are, of course, all of our bedrock environmental laws that, have the potential to protect species, whether through protecting habitat or water, the Clean Water Act, NEPA, the Clean Air Act. All of these laws play a role in protecting the environment and will be important as we move ahead.
That leads into my question for Rebecca, which is I'm sure on the legal side, you're using these risk assessments and you're seeing all these things and seeing the differences between a bee, like Saff said, that is least concern or more concern, and then something that is really drawn out and shown to you. Here's its diet, here's its activities, here's its range. So, my question is how do you use that information on the legal side to strengthen and enforce legal protections for bees and other pollinators?
So, the Federal Endangered Species Act has protections for species that are listed as either threatened or endangered. So, all the protections that come from that law start from a listing. But to get a species listed, there is what's called a petition process. Now, anyone can petition the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for bees or NOAA fisheries for aquatic species to get a species listed. But when you submit that petition, what you are doing is you want to provide all of the scientific evidence that you have to demonstrate that the species is at risk of extinction and deserves protection under the Act. So the more science that we have, the better. And when the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is looking at a bee species to consider whether it should be listed as threatened or endangered, it's required to use what's called the best available science. And so if the best available science out there demonstrate that the species is in trouble, which these risk assessments that Sapp is describing have the potential to do, that's how we start to get bees protected under the Act. Now, it's so important to get some species listed as threatened or endangered, but it's not critical to get all of them listed because the same action that can protect one species of bees can protect others. Now, it's not enough to just have one bee species protected because, it probably lives in a very small place. But most bee species, all bee species are threatened by, for example, neonic pesticide use. And so if you get protections under the Act for bee species and they live in a range of places across the country, you can start to use the law to tackle that threat. The EPA actually just put out an assessment of 3 neonics under the Endangered Species Act, which is what they're required to do under the law when they're going to take an action that could affect a species. And so the action they're about to take is to re-register some of these pesticides. So under the law, they're required to do a consultation. And as part of that consultation, they lay out what they believe their action will do to threatened and endangered species. And what they found is that reapproving these pesticides could jeopardize the continued existence of many pollinating species. Now, this is kind of the magic language in the Endangered Species Act. And what is so important to know is it's actually very rare for the Fish and Wildlife Service to say an action may ultimately jeopardize a species. So the fact that EPA is saying we think this action we are going to take is likely to jeopardize these species is incredibly significant. Now, the Fish and Wildlife Service is going to take that information. They will do their own assessment. They are the expert agency when it comes to endangered species. And if it is indeed the case that they find that this action is likely to create jeopardy for species, they're going to come up with a plan, an alternative plan for EPA to take this action in a way that will not cause jeopardy, because that's what the law requires. And so, starting all the way from getting a species listed using this science and taking it through evaluating effects of actions taken by federal agencies like pesticide approvals, that's how getting species listed under the Endangered Species Act can start to chip away at some of these threats.
Thanks so much for explaining, Rebecca. We touched on this earlier, but I'm sure you've both heard that mainstream rallying cry, save the bees. It's sort of made its way into popular culture. You can find it on a tote bag, on t-shirts, on mugs, on stickers. But when you break it down, this saying is really broad. We have more than 350,000 pollinator species on the planet and somewhere around 20,000 species of bees alone. I'm hearing that you're mentioning all of these legal frameworks and laws that could protect bees, but is it possible to create legal frameworks to protect all of them? And what do we do if certain species slip through the cracks?
So, right now, the laws that we have can't protect all species. But the way that the Endangered Species Act work is that provides protections for species that focus on the threats. And so, if you are tackling threats like pesticide overuse, like habitat loss for one bee species, that can help another bee species that lives in the same area. And so, it is a tool, it is an important tool, but you're right, it's insufficient. I should also add the work we need to do to recover species under the Endangered Species Act requires funding. And the Fish and Wildlife Service has been very underfunded for decades. And so, one of the things we need to do to recover species like these is to provide the Fish and Wildlife Service the funding they need so that they can carry out recovery plans so that we can bring species back to a level where they are healthy again, where they're helping to balance the ecosystem, and where we have kind of this ideal state of affairs, which is really the goal of the Endangered Species Act, to bring species back to that healthy place.
In addition to creating legal frameworks that protect as many pollinators as possible, we also need to continue to advocate for the funding that helps us understand what the specific needs of all of our different pollinators are. So, although legal protection for some species may have this umbrella effect, which protects species that we know a little bit less about that maybe aren't legally protected, some of our pollinators have these really interesting, unique life histories, and they may have specific requirements in order to protect them that we don't yet know about. So, in addition to continuing to support the frameworks that we do have, like the Endangered Species Act, we need to continue the research element to be able to understand what the specific needs of all of our different pollinators are.
What are some ways in which law and science could better support pollinators?
On the science end, in order to support the work that I do, we need a national bee monitoring program so that we can better understand some of the most elemental things about bee biology and track things like species occupancy or changes in population trends. A national bee monitoring program would be huge in advancing our understanding of bee extinction risk. And that's something that my colleagues, namely Dr. Hollis Woodard, has been advocating for through the National Bee Monitoring Network. And then also increased funding basically at every level here. So from the taxonomists that work to define bee species diversity, even just to funding the initiative that I work on, the State of the Bees initiative. I have funding through 2026 to work to assess the conservation status of 500 species. That's just a chunk of the 3,000 species that we don't yet understand. And then additional funding to address some of the science gaps, including things like understanding pesticide toxicity to bees other than honeybees. So, right now, most pesticides are tested only on honeybees, and we extrapolate the results of that out to all of these other native bees, but it probably isn't super meaningful. So, yeah, funding is always one of the big issues.
On the legal side, we need to do more to tackle all of the major threats to bees, whether that's climate, habitat loss, or pesticide overuse. And right now, the law is not doing enough across any of these threats. And so, working at the federal level and working at the state level and at the local level, we need to work to strengthen the protections for these species and identify ways we can reduce these threats.
Great. Are there any final thoughts or insights either of you would like to share?
Yeah, I think we've spent a lot of time highlighting so many of the challenges and the data that we wish we had, but we do know enough about threats to pollinators generally to take action now at multiple scales. So this includes at the individual level. Individuals can work to reduce their reliance on pesticides in their yards. We can work to create habitat in residential and public areas. We can contribute to community science initiatives. And so I really encourage folks to check out all of the resources that are available through the Xerces website. And I'm sure Rebecca has some ideas here too, just to see how individuals can help advance the conservation of pollinators and other invertebrates at their local level.
I think that's a great point. I think individual action can play a huge role in protecting pollinators. And I also think we should be excited about the progress we're seeing on this issue. It isn't something that was really front of mind for people until, maybe the past 10 to 15 years. And we're starting to see progress on neonics in particular. We're seeing states taking action. We're seeing local cities, local park districts taking steps forward. And this is the type of action that can snowball and really make an impact across the country. And so I think there's a lot of reason to be hopeful, but a lot of work to do as well.
I really appreciate you both coming on and sharing these excellent insights today. It was a pleasure to hear about all of the different actions we're taking on bees and to learn a little bit more about these small but mighty creatures who live very complex lives and are so essential to our agricultural and food systems. So thank you again for joining me. This has been People, Places, Planet, and stay tuned for our next episode.
Thanks for listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute. Our work wouldn't be possible without the support of people like you. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, attend one of our events, or support our work financially, head to eli.org.